to our class today. There we go. And we always have people both at home and out of town who are with us, and so we're grateful that you're there. If you're at home, on our website, if you go there and you'll find newsletter, at the bottom right-hand corner of the link that goes to newsletter is the link to get outlines, and today would be a really helpful time to get an outline if you're at home. And we'll be doing a couple of things early that will give you some time to do that. We're going to look at 2 or 3 verses that are listed at the very top of this outline. And I want us to start in 2 Samuel chapter 7 today. And we're going to kind of back up a little bit and then go forward a little bit because now that the city of Jerusalem has been finally destroyed after the 3rd time, and only a handful of just the very poorest of people are there, then there's going to be some questions that God's people are going to ask, basically for another 600 years. And we're going to come and look at that as we do this. In 2 Samuel 7, and this is starting verse particularly like 12 and down through 14, David has it in his heart to build a complete physical structure, a temple for the Lord. And initially God says, you can do that. And then he sends the prophet back and he says, no, you have shed so much blood as a warrior, you will not build the house. And there's a pun, there's a play on words. Instead of David making God a house, God says, I'm going to make of you a house. And he's not talking about wood and he's not talking about windows, but he's talking about descendants. So in 2 Samuel 7 and verse 12, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come forth from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He will build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be his father, and he will be my son. And as you look through, and we're anticipating even going to Matthew 1 for a second, there are several promises and there are several covenants that God makes along the way, but 2 of the very, very significant ones are back in Genesis 12. God says to Abraham, now through you I'm going to bless all nations. And God is going to continue to keep that covenant promise. And if you remember, Abraham is 2,000 years before Jesus. And that always just, this will change, if the world goes on for a few hundred years. But it's kind of helpful for us to think, okay, now Abraham is as far before the cross as we are after the cross. And that's the promise that God made to him. David is going to be 1,000 years later, and God is going to say, someone is going to reign on your throne forever. And what's going to happen is that now that the city of Jerusalem has been destroyed, and there is not a kingdom there, then how is God going to fulfill that promise? And what we're going to see today, and this is why we want to just kind of stop and kind of go over this, is that when you look at Matthew 1, and you have the genealogies from Abraham down to David, and there may be more people, but Matthew brings them in groups of 7. And then when you come to David, you're going to have David, Solomon, Rehoboam, Abijah, Asa, Jehoshaphat, Jehoram, Ahaziah. Athaliah is not in there. And then Uzzah, Jotham, Ahaz, Hezekiah, Manasseh, Ammon, Josiah, Jehoiakim, Jehoiachin, and Zedekiah is the last king. And that brings you down to the destruction of Jerusalem. And what we're going to see today is that after the destruction of Jerusalem, there is not a king that is on the throne, but the lineage of David, the family of David continues, and then we're going to see Jeconiah, Shealtiel, Zerubbabel, Abiud, Eliakim, and these guys will take us down into the time of Jesus. And so after the destruction of Jerusalem, which is where we are, the seed of David, the lineage of David, goes from a crown and sitting on a throne to common people. But as we're going to notice, Jesus' adopted father his father is Jacob. Here is Joseph, the son of David. Now, if you'd also look at Psalm 89, because here is a psalm that is going to be the last psalm of the third book, and God's people have been taken into captivity. And if you are one of the survivors in captivity, and you go back and you read this promise, and God says, I'm going to bless your descendants, David. Someone is going to sit on your throne forever. And there's no kingdom, and there's no king, and there's no throne. There's a very legitimate question. God, what are you going to do about this? Where's your promises? You know, you're the God that brought us out of Egypt. You're the God that brought us through the Red Sea. You're the God that we crossed Jordan and we came in. And then you made this promise. And in Psalm 89, the psalmist says, I will sing of thy steadfast love, O Lord, forever. With my mouth, I will proclaim thy faithfulness to all generations. And then here it comes, thy steadfast love. And again, this is such an important word. We don't have an English term that's quite big enough. It's God's covenant love. It's God's loving kindness. It's God's faithfulness. It's God's dependability. God's steadfast love was established forever. Thy faithfulness is firm as the heavens. Thou hast said, I have made a covenant with my chosen one. I have sworn to David, my servant. I will establish your descendants forever, and I will build your throne for all your generations. And then even as you read down later in Psalm 89, you'll see in verse 34, I will not violate my covenant. I have sworn by my holiness. I will not lie to David. His line shall endure forever. His throne as long as the sun before me. And like the moon, it shall be established forever. It will stand firm while the skies endure. So, here's the dilemma for God's people, and again, it's going to go on for nearly 500 years. What are you doing about this, God? We know your steadfast love. We know your dependability. There's no king. There's no one physically, literally sitting on the throne. And the very idea that this is going to become Jesus hundreds of years later is not in their perspective yet because that event hasn't taken place. Lord willing, on Wednesday nights in October, we're going to look at the 400 years between Malachi and Matthew. And what I think is very important, just to give us, again, a little bit of perspective, I wouldn't say this with your grandkids, they wouldn't get it, but how different is our country in 1976 compared to 1776? Everybody see where I'm going now? When we had our bicentennial of the founding of the country, and you just look back, how different is the United States from 1776 to 1976? Imagine how different, if the Lord doesn't come back, it's going to be 400 years later. It's just staggering, the change and the difference that's going to be there. After the book of Malachi, we have this extended period of silence. God's going to give a vision to Daniel and say, this is what's going to happen, and it's very precise, and it brings us all the way down to the feet of the statue to the Roman Empire. But how does God break the silence? I am Gabriel. I came from the presence of God. And I just get the shudders when I think of this because just before the Old Testament closes, God sends Gabriel. God is strong, God is mighty, E-L, Gabriel. God sends Gabriel to David and says, this is what's going to transpire in terms of international politics for the next 400 years. And then of all things, God sends Gabriel to Zechariah and says, Zechariah, you're going to have a son. You will call his name John. And Zechariah learned the hard way, you don't argue with God, because he's not able to speak until the son's actually born. But the other thing that's so amazing, and this is in Luke chapter 1, she's just a young, innocent girl who is engaged, and her name is Mary. And of all things, God sends a messenger from the throne of heaven to talk to Mary. And I'm in Luke chapter 1, and listen to what Gabriel says. Don't be afraid. That's easy for an angel to say, but you know, if you're just minding your own business and all of a sudden this angel appears, I would be afraid. And this is one of the most frequent, reoccurring observations, sometimes statements, commands. Don't be afraid, all through the Bible. But here's Gabriel coming to Mary, says, don't be afraid. You have found favor with God. You will be with child and give birth to a son, and you are to give him the name Jesus. He will be great and will be called the Son of the Most High. And here it comes. The Lord will give him the throne of his father David, and he will reign over the house of Jacob forever. His kingdom will never end. Now, a lot of times, and this is even kind of hard for us to kind of work with, but a lot of times girls were engaged at 13 and 14. And here she is, betrothed, engaged to Joseph, and this angel comes and says, yes, and you're going to have a son. The nearest I can relate to the age thing is that my great-grandmother, and we're back into the late 1800s, was married at 14 years and 9 months. There used to be a train that ran from Nebraska to Indian Territory. Doxey was just east of Sayre. And in 1901, she's now the wise old age of 18. She has 3 boys that are 4 and under, and she gets on a train and comes to Indian Territory. Her husband comes on the next train in the boxcar, livestock. He rides the farm implements so the cows and stuff don't get their feet caught in the harrows and break a hoof or something, household stuff. It's too late to build a house, so they literally dig a dugout in the side of the red shale hill out there and kill one of their animals to have a skin for the door. And my family comes to Indian Territory and spends the first winter in a dugout with 3 little guys that are 4 and under. Mothers, can you imagine? Wintertime, hard, cold ground. That's how my family gets here. And so when you come to Mary, you're not probably talking about a 16, 18. She's probably very, very young. And what does she hear? Your son is going to sit on the throne of David. Becky, if you're 12 or 13, how do you even comprehend that? I mean, it's just beyond comprehension. And here's what's very important, and this is kind of the thread and the flow today. When God makes a promise, it's not always going to happen just right then and there. But my dad would say, you go crawl under a rock and wait for a few hundred years to come by, and God hasn't forgotten that promise. And so the promise that God makes 1,000 years earlier to David is going to be fulfilled with Mary, and the most unbelievable part has yet to come. It's going to be a miraculous conception. But very specifically, Gabriel comes from the presence of God to tell Mary, oh, by the way, God is going to fulfill this promise that he made to David. This happens a lot, and those who listen and been in classes can just see how my mind works. But who is the first person that we meet in the New Testament? This is the genealogy of Jesus Christ, son of David, son of Abraham. Matthew knows his genealogy, and he'll start with Abraham, and then will come David. But the very first person that we meet in the New Testament is David. Guess who the last human being that we meet in the book of Revelation is? I am the root and the offspring of David. And so this promise that God makes to David in 2 Samuel 7, he is going to take 1,000 years to fulfill. And after Jesus is crucified, what happens? He ascends to the Father, and the Hebrew writer says, having made atonement, having made purification for our sins, what does he do? He sits down at the right hand of the Father in heaven, and no one for 1,000 years could possibly have thought, when God fulfills this promise that someone's going to reign on the throne, a descendant of David forever, that it's going to be Jesus Christ. And unlike, bless their hearts, there are people who are waiting for Jesus to come back and reign in Jerusalem. You have this description of a red heifer in the Old Testament, and there are groups of people that are going to help God. They are keeping a herd of red cows, so there will be a red heifer ready to sacrifice when Jesus comes back to reign in Jerusalem. He's never coming back. The trumpet will sound, the dead in Christ will be raised. We shall do what? Meet him in the air, and so shall we ever be with the Lord. But God is going to fulfill the promise to David, ultimately, by having Jesus, the son of David, ascend into heaven, and after his blood has been offered for our sins, he sits down on the right hand of God, and he's going to be there forever, and that's how God's going to fulfill that promise. So this is something that to me is very significant, and we're going to always talk about this in different ways. Lord willing, next week we'll look at Joseph, but remember Genesis 37 through 50? You can look at the biography, the details of this young man sold into slavery and all the things that happened in Egypt. Secondly, you can come back and look at the nation. What is God doing? And he's fulfilling the promises back with Abraham. But the level that we always need to come back to is God. As we read through the pages of Scripture, God reveals himself through the events and through the people and through the promises that he makes. And this is something that's very significant. Now we've had a brief introduction. Let's start with our outline today, okay? Number one, God promised David descendants reigning on his throne, and this is done through the kings of Judah until the fall of Jerusalem. And especially if you're at home, please be turning to 2 Chronicles 36. And we always have people both out of town and out of the country who are listening in. And especially if you don't have an outline, turn to 2 Chronicles 36, and we'll come to that in a second. But here's what we're going to notice today. There are two times that the promise that God makes to David about his descendants, we are down to one little boy. One heartbeat, I like to say. And notice this, and I'm at 1-2 if you have the outline. Here's 1-2-1, Athaliah. And I'm sorry, the word just kind of witch comes to mind every time I hear her. She's so evil. She usurps the throne, and she decides, okay, to establish myself on the throne, then we're going to kill all of the boys who are relatives of the king. And thankfully, the nurse grabs Joash and hides him, and remember, we use the expression, they raise him in the temple. That's the one, she is so evil and so ungodly, the one place that she's never going to go is the temple. And so I just love this expression. They turned the temple into a nursery, into a playpen. And again, you try to hide a 6-year-old boy, up to 1 to 6. We have 3 little guys that are within a year of each other. And it is an absolute circus when you get 3 little boys that are 4 or 5 together. And I always read through this, and I think someone's going to have to be watching all the time because he's going to shoot out the door or get outside. And if she hears about him, she's going to kill him. and we're down to one heartbeat, and at 7, they proclaim him as king. He grows up, he has descendants, and the line of David goes on. 1:2:2. Zedekiah is Judah's last reigning king. And if you have the outline, look down about 2/3 of the way down, and you see like the little lines that are there. And let me just explain this. You can see this also in 2 Chronicles 36. Josiah is the last godly king. And he's going to have 3 sons, and that's the next row: Jehoaz, Jehoiakim, and Zedekiah. But if you look under Jehoiakim, there was a little boy who's going to reign for 3 years and 10 days. Sorry, I said that wrong. 3 months and 10 days. So let's start at the top. Josiah is going to die. And then the first king, if you go to the left, is going to be Jehoaz, and he's going to reign for a grand total of 3 months. Then the second son of Josiah is going to reign, and that's going to be Jehoiakim for 11 years. And after his reign, his son is Jehoiachin, and we'll see Jeconiah, but we'll just stay with Jehoiachin. And the grandson reigns for 3 months, 10 days. He's carried off into Babylon, and then Zedekiah reigns. Okay, everybody kind of see the family tree? And let's notice what happens. We're going to go through the outline kind of right at the very, you see the word king and the age when he's crowned. So notice the things that are going to happen. After Josiah dies, both the king of Egypt is going to appoint one, and Nebuchadnezzar is going to appoint 2 kings in Judah, and every time they appoint a son of David. I'm confident they have no idea that they're helping to fulfill the promises of God. But they're going to displace, replace kings, but every time a descendant of David is chosen while we're going through this very, very last part of the Old Testament. So we'll start with Josiah, okay? Everybody find Josiah? He's 8 years old when he begins to reign. He's going to reign 31 years. He's the last of the good and the godly kings, and foolishly he goes out to prevent Pharaoh Necho from going north to fight against Assyria and gets killed. So, like I said, if you're in 2 Chronicles 36, here's the next 4 kings. Jehoaz is 23 years old. He reigns for 3 months, and the king of Egypt deposes him and then appoints Eliakim, who's his brother, to become the king, but he names him Jehoiakim. So if you see Jehoiakim right under Josiah, he's the second son that becomes the king. At the end of his reign is the first capture of Jerusalem in 606. And so when Jehoiakim is carried away, then Nebuchadnezzar appoints his son to become the king. And this is kind of tragic. This is Jehoiachin. He's 8 years old. Okay, an 8-year-old is not going to run the kingdom. He's going to have either advisors or other things. But this little 8-year-old boy is only king for 3 months and 10 days, and Nebuchadnezzar takes this 8-year-old little boy to Babylon and then appoints his uncle to become the king and names him Zedekiah. So everybody see what's happened? Josiah is going to have 3 sons and a grandson who are all appointed to be the king. And so when you come to the number 2 in the dark line, there's the second capture of Jerusalem. Zedekiah is 21 years old. He reigns for 11 years. And then Zedekiah is going to be the king. And this is the king during the time of Jeremiah, and he will listen to Jeremiah, but he won't listen. Come in and tell me what's going to happen, but he won't do the things that Jeremiah says. And we're going to read this, but let me just tell you what happens. When the city of Jerusalem is destroyed the third time, Zedekiah tries to escape, and they go through the walls. He is captured, and this is gross, so get ready. They take him to Nebuchadnezzar, and they bring all of Zedekiah's sons before him, and the last thing that he sees is that they kill every one of his sons. And then they put his eyes out and take him to Babylon. I mean, you just shudder. I mean, you just imagine, here you are, you're captured, they bring all of your blood sons in front of you, they kill every one of them, and the last thing physically that you see with your eyes is your own sons being killed, and then they put his eyes out and they carry him off to Babylon. Well, if it was only up to Zedekiah and we kill all of his sons, the line ends, right? But guess what? A grandson has already been sent to Babylon and lives there and grows up there, and it's going to be the grandson who is the bottom one, I underline Jehoiachin. He was only king for 3 months and 10 days. He's carried as a prisoner to Babylon. There, he's going to have sons, and it's going to be the sons of the little boy carried to Babylon that continue the life of Jesus. So, let's read through the things under the dotted line. Jehoiachin, and his name will also be changed to Jeconiah, is brought to Babylon at 8 years of age. He is treated well in Babylon. After Nebuchadnezzar, his name is Evil-Merodach, Babylon's next king, is going to release Jehoiachin from prison after 37 years. So follow the thread. An 8-year-old boy gets carried away to Babylon, having been king for 3 months. He lives in prison for 37 years. He is released, and he eats regularly at the king's table from the time he's 45 until he dies. And I put this in bold. Here's amazing. Archaeologists have unearthed tablets in Babylon which list Jehoiachin and 5 of his sons. When the exiles returned to Jerusalem, we're at 1:4 on the bottom. When the exiles returned to Jerusalem, the line of David now progresses through the generations of common people in contrast to the previous kings. So we're now in Matthew 1. And watch what happens. We're going to have the descendants of Abraham down to David. We're going to have David down to the destruction. But then his name in Matthew is going to be Jehoiachin. And Matthew says, after the deportation to Babylon, Jehoiachin, Jeconiah, whichever you want to call him, was the father of Shealtiel, and Shealtiel the father of Zerubbabel, and Zerubbabel the father of Abiud. And as you keep going, then here's Jacob, the father of Joseph, the husband of Mary. And then when Matthew records this, he says, of whom Jesus, and I put the son of David, was born, who is called the Christ. So when you look at the family tree in Matthew, and you go from Jeconiah to Shealtiel, and the third one is Zerubbabel, and then you go back and look in the book of Ezra, Ezra chapter 2, the very first part, and Ezra chapter 3, Zerubbabel is the man that God raises to say, let's go back to Jerusalem. And so the leader of the first of 3 groups of exiles who go back to Jerusalem is a son of David. His grandfather was carried off into captivity as 8 years of age, has children in Babylon, and Zerubbabel starts the first group of people who comes back. And here's the bottom line. To fulfill his promise to David, God hides one little boy in the temple until he's 7, and he sends another little boy to Babylon at 8. And it's going to be their descendants that keep the promise alive to David. And I read this and I just always just kind of shake down the chills and just think, isn't this amazing? God makes a promise, and normal people are living their lives, and I'm thinking everybody from Abraham to David, and they're doing this, and then little do they know that up here, in ways that they never see and they never understand, God is working with them and through them and for them to accomplish things that they never did understand or comprehend at the time, and yet this is the nature of God. Take this with at least a grain of salt. I have always enjoyed listening to older preachers. And when you start getting older, there's fewer of them, but I'll just drive miles to listen to a guy, whether it's Charles or someone who's preached for decades and decades. And just 2 or 3 years ago, Howard Norton spoke at a preacher's retreat down at Medill. And right in the middle of his stuff, and for whatever else he was saying, he said something that I'll just never forget. He said, I'm confident that none of us in this life will understand the most important thing we did for God. And he said sometimes things that we would never comprehend or we would never look back and say, you know, that was the most important thing that I did. And he said one of the reasons that we should be just faithful every day is that we don't know what God is going to do with a cup of cold water. We don't know what God is going to use someone to do or someone to help. And this apparently happened in Tennessee and in Texas. And I heard this first from W.B. West. And, when you're 22, he was really old. Wayne, he was 72. And just really, really ancient. And his best friend was E.H. Imes, and he was 92. And so if you had a class with Brother West, then the young man, the 72-year-old teacher, would bring the 92-year-old man into class. And Brother West told us of a church, and he had read the thing. You remember when we used to have 2-week meetings, and we'd bring a song leader in and bring a preacher in, and this church had a 2-week meeting, and it's like, everybody just kind of went like this because we preached the gospel, we brought a song leader in, we brought a preacher in. And the quote that Brother West read was that we were disappointed that only one, and get ready girls, 12-year-old knock-kneed little girl was baptized. And Gary, we spent 2 weeks, we brought a preacher in, we brought a song leader in, and we all just kind of go, okay. We probably wouldn't say it that way, but this was the quote. A 12-year-old knock-kneed little girl was baptized, and we're glad that, but we're really disappointed. Time goes by, and this 12-year-old girl grows up and gets married. She has 5 sons, and every one of her sons become gospel preachers. Do you see what I'm saying? What did God do with this failure of a meeting when we hoped that we'd baptize all of these people and we'd hoped that all of this would happen and the community would be changed? And they were all just kind of let down because it was just one little 12-year-old girl was the only one baptized. But listen to my dad, you go crawl under a rock and you give God a little bit of time, and we never know what God is going to do with things that at the time we would never understand the importance of them. And so when you open your New Testament and some of you will quickly read through those genealogies, then today I want you to stop and think, and God made the promises, and God kept them, and if he has to hide a little boy in the temple for 6 years, and then later send another little boy into Babylon when he's 8 years old until he's released from prison, God is going to keep the promise to David that one of your descendants is going to sit on the throne. In Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the primary reason that Jesus gets crucified is that there's a lot of sons of David, but they're looking for the son of David. And isn't it amazing? The blind people, especially in the book of Matthew, when they come to Jesus, the blind people, they say, "Son of David, have mercy on us." And here's God fulfilling his promises hundreds and hundreds of years later. We're on the back side. We'll highlight some things and we'll be headed toward finishing up. As we close with the things with Ezekiel, God appoints him to be a watchman on the wall. And this is something that's very important. If you're the watchman, Ezekiel, and you see someone coming, if you warn the people and they don't listen, you've done your job. Their blood will be on their head. On the other hand, if you don't warn the people, then their blood will be on your head. This is so true of our elders, this is true of ministers, but it's also true of you and I. There are times that I have heard elders admonish someone about a decision that they're about to make and warn them about that, and the people choose to go ahead and do that anyway. The elders have done what God's asked them to do. And one of the things that we need to do as Christians is to be that watchman, and we can't be responsible for what someone chooses to do. But one of the functions that Jeremiah has, and I think this applies to a lot of us, it's very important that the watchman notify and warn people. It's so ironic, and here we are in Ezekiel number 3, the people charge, God is not just. And I'm sorry, this is just, it's so backwards. It's so inside out. And God is not just for these things to happen, but God says, I am just. And the last two lines, the one who does what is lawful and right shall live. You say, the way of the Lord is not just. O house of Israel, I will judge each of you according to his ways. And one of the verses, and I'm not trying to, but I just think this is important. One of the verses that we need to always keep in mind is that it is appointed unto man once to die, and then what happens? Then comes the judgment. And that's something we just need to be very conscious of, is that God is going to judge us. Bless his heart, this is number 4. Ezekiel, at times, is not able to speak. He's dumb, and there's times that he's even bound. Can you imagine Tim Lewis not being able to talk? I mean, Kristen, can you imagine what our office would be like if we go for a year and Tim is not able to? I mean, he's just going to bust. I mean, he would be writing things down and typing things out. And just imagine someone who loves to preach and they can't talk. Well, here's a prophet who speaks for God, and there are times that God literally seals his lips and he can't talk. On the 12th year of our exile, the 9th month and the 5th day, see how specific? A man who had escaped from Jerusalem came to me and said, the city has fallen. What has happened before this? Remember, Ezekiel has seen this vision of the glory of God leaving the temple already. I still just can hardly read this. In chapter 24, Ezekiel, tonight, your wife is going to die. And you're not to mourn. You're not to put on sackcloth and ashes. And this is how God is going to feel about the destruction of the city. And so here's our prophet, and a fugitive says, the city has fallen. The hand of the Lord had been upon me in the evening before the fugitive came, and he opened my mouth by the time the man came to me in the morning. So my mouth was opened, and I was no longer dumb. And the prophet is able to speak after the fall of Jerusalem. Because of time, and any one of these could have been an entire lesson, Ezekiel 34 is one of the most significant passages in the Bible about what not to do as a shepherd. And there's a very important lesson for shepherds to read Ezekiel 34 and to do the opposite of what they're charged with. They feed themselves, they take care of themselves, they don't look after others, they don't look after the lost. And there's a great deal said about how not to shepherd, that if you turn that around, I think is a very helpful thing. There's prophecies against Edom, Mount Seir, blessings for Israel. We could actually have done the whole lesson on the dry bones in Ezekiel 37. And that's what I say. Ezekiel's the visual aid prophet, and he goes out, and here's just these dry bones, and prophesy to these bones. Leg bones connect to the knee. You know the song? And there's a song about all of these bones coming together, and then they're just laying there, and then God continues to work with them, and flesh comes on them. And then there's like the speaking of God, and breath comes into these dry bones, and they actually become people again. Amazing visual. Gog and Magog, and punishment and evil, and like I said, echoes of this are going to continue on into Revelation. And then we're not going to have time to actually do this, but one of the most splendid visions of a temple from 40 to 48 of Ezekiel is given. And a physical temple has never been built according to this description. And people who are millennial and looking for the 1,000-year reign are still waiting for this temple to be built. So let's walk through these bottom ones. While God's people are in exile, God is still fulfilling his promises. He hasn't forgotten. And even though they're carried away thousands of miles and they live in captivity, the 70 years are over, they come back, God is still fulfilling his promises. God is faithful. And I love this expression in 2 Corinthians. All the promises of God find their yes in him, that's Jesus. Ezekiel, he's more of a sideshow. Son of man, speak the word. With their lips they show much love, but their heart is far from me. You are like one who sings love songs with a beautiful voice, plays well on an instrument. They will hear what you say, but they will not do it. And when this comes, it will, then they will know that a prophet has been among them. And this to me is very significant. This Jeremiah and Ezekiel are faithful in spite of the lack of reception and hearing that they got. God is still working with his people. I will restore the fortunes. I will have mercy on them. And it's not because of them. I will be jealous for my holy name, says the Lord, when I have brought them back. I will vindicate my holiness. I sent them into exile. I will not hide my face, and when I pour out my spirit. But here's something very significant. As all of these things are happening toward the end of the time the people are in Jerusalem, and as they're carried into captivity, the thing that God's most interested in is people's hearts. And you'll just hear me say this over and over and again. Teacher, what is the first and greatest commandment? Love the Lord your God with all your heart. And I oftentimes tell parents, I think from the time our little ones are 1, especially till 5 or 6, we want to win their hearts for God. And coming to church is wonderful, and this is God's family. Because if we don't win their hearts, we're not going to win their soul. And notice what God says about their hearts. I will cleanse you from all your uncleanness, and from the idols I will cleanse you. A new heart I will give you, and a new spirit I will put within you. I will take out of you the flesh of the heart of stone, and I will give you a heart of flesh. I will put my spirit within you, and cause you to walk in my statutes, and be careful to observe all of my ordinances. You will dwell in the land which I gave to your fathers, and you shall be my people, and I will be your God. And I love that, and Lord willing, at a later time, we'll just do a lesson on that one thought, because I like to think of that as the dream of God. The dream of God is, I keep sending my servants the prophets, the people won't hear, but God says, I will be their God, and they will be my people. And it always is interesting is that we finally come to the book of Jerusalem, and we have a holy city, we have holy people, we have holy angels, and finally, God will fulfill his dream, and he says, I will be their God, and they will be my people. And it's all a matter of heart.